Jack, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today. How does it feel? You are not just sort of now a #1 bestseller. You're, I don't know what the metric is, top downloaded, streamed series on Amazon. You're a celebrity. I see the pictures. You're hanging out with Chris Pratt at UFC fights. How does it feel?
Well, you know what? As a child of the 80s, you kind of just thought that whatever you dreamt, you could achieve. And I never thought that I wouldn't do the things that I was dreaming about back then. The first one was to be a Navy SEAL, serve my country in uniform. And the second was then to write thrillers, because I was growing up reading Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and David Morrell and A.J. Quinnell and J.C. Pollock and Mark Olden and Stephen Hunter and all these guys who wrote these thrillers who had protagonists that had typically backgrounds in Vietnam back then. If you were growing up in the 80s, the typical action hero in TV, movie, and in these kind of thrillers was either a Marine sniper in Vietnam, a Navy SEAL in Vietnam, Army Special Forces Vietnam, CIA paramilitary in Vietnam. So I just kind of always thought, after the military, I'll write #1 New York Times best-selling novels, and then A-list star and director will option it. It'll go to the screen. And I just kind of thought that's what you did, and I never wasted any time. And even not just as a kid, even as I was getting out of the Navy, I didn't really waste any time worrying about agents, because I didn't know I needed one, websites, social media, worrying about, would Simon & Schuster going to pick this up? I just assumed that they would. And then I picked Chris Pratt as the guy I wanted to portray my character as I'm typing away in our rental in Coronado, California, just off the bedroom, with no connections to Hollywood, no connections to New York publishing. I just thought this is how it's going to go. And I didn't waste any bandwidth worrying about it not happening. I put all that effort into the story. So it feels good, but it also feels pretty natural. I mean, it just feels normal.
That's interesting. So you've basically manifested your dream. You don't have to sit around and pinch yourself, because it sounds like you've been scheming isn't the right word, but visualizing and manifesting this entire career, this life, as you point out, from a Navy SEAL to now a best-selling author and a television film producer, including down to the detail of Chris Pratt driving the vehicle. But before we go into all of that detail, and I do want to go into all of that detail, I'm just curious, the life that you find yourself in today, and I mean that. I was on your Instagram page the other day, and I see you, at a UFC fight, I believe it was in Las Vegas with Chris Pratt. The life that you are living today, is that vastly different? Is it, surrounded by bright lights and glitz and glamour, as juxtaposed against the life you were living for 20 years on the SEAL teams? I know there is this brotherhood and camaraderie and testosterone probably involved in both worlds, but I'm curious how different. While you visualized the dream, the world seems to, at least from the outside, have changed drastically.
Yeah, I still have, head down, nose to the grindstone, working. So it's always been work. Even when I was a little kid, I didn't realize it, but all the time that I was spending preparing myself physically and mentally, when I'm running trails or I'm playing lacrosse or soccer or backpacking through the Sierras with my family, all of that was in preparation to eventually test myself in BUDS in the SEAL teams. At the same time, I'm studying, even at a young age, studying warfare, terrorism, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, and that's never stopped. And reading those authors that I mentioned earlier, I didn't realize it at the time, but they were giving me my early education in the art of storytelling from the masters out there. So it's been work. And then in the SEAL teams, obviously you want to make yourself the best operator, the best leader you possibly can, because that's what you owe the guys you're taking down range. It's what you owe their families, the mission, by default, the country. You have to be fully engaged at all time. You have to earn your trident every day, is what we call it. And I'm still earning it, I think, every single day. So it's just, second I wake up till well past sundown, when everyone else in the house is asleep, I'm still working, still building this foundation. So that part hasn't changed. And the kids are completely unimpressed with everything, whether it's the Navy SEAL stuff or for a little bit with Chris Pratt, Chris made my daughter a video and my son a video and said hi and, all that stuff. So I was cool for about 30 seconds, or however long that video was, maybe 45 seconds, a minute possibly. And then went right back to just being a normal dad. So they're completely unimpressed by all of it. So to me, it doesn't seem like too much has changed, other than having some flexibility and some other options, which is what I wanted in today's day and age. That kind of equates to a little more freedom. I never wanted to work for anybody else. Over the last 20 years in the SEAL teams, you're working essentially for your guys, and that means personally and professionally, you know each of them, and you're mentoring them along. You want them to do the job better than you're doing it for them, so it's a stronger unit going forward as a team, and it's just been work. So I think maybe at some point I'll take a breath and look around, but I haven't gotten to that stage quite yet. It's still work, sun up to sundown. Well before sun up and well past sundown.
All right, so nose down, nose to the grindstone, whether or not it's in the SEAL teams or it's producing content now. I get that. You know, when I go into these conversations, I don't think I try to force a theme, but my curiosity seems to draw connections. And so when I think about you, the thing that I am most curious about comes back to this theme of inspiration. I'm curious what has inspired you. And I want to do this in a very organized fashion. I want to talk about the inspiration for the books. And you talked about some of the guys that you read growing up. But I want to start with your inspiration, not just to be a SEAL, but to serve. You told us growing up, you were hiking trails, you were playing sports. I'm curious, when did you know I want to serve in the United States military?
Yes, the military, I can't remember ever wanting to do anything else, but SEALs specifically, I was at the ripe old age of 7. And that's because back then I knew I was going to join the military. I grew up with these pictures of my grandfather and his squadron from World War II. He was killed off Okinawa in 1945 near the end of the war. But I grew up with those pictures, with his medals, with the silk maps that they used to give aviators back then, because if you hit the water with a paper map, it would just disintegrate, but a silk map just gets wet and you can use it. So I have those still to this day. But as a kid, I would just look at those things and I try to imagine what he was like, because back then you couldn't just join a Facebook group that have of his old squadron or anything like that. So my dad didn't know anyone who knew his father. I didn't know anyone, obviously, but our connection to him were those items. And then there was a show on TV called Black Sheep Squadron, where Robert Conrad played Pappy Boynton, Marine Corps fighter pilot, which is what my grandfather was, flew the Corsair, which is the plane that had the wings, the gold wings that would fold up like that. And so I was just drawn to the military from an early age because of that. And then I think it was just innate. I think there was just this, whatever that gene is that makes you want to serve and protect both your family, your tribe, your country. That was just in me from a very early age. So at 7, found out what SEALs were, because if you grew up in the 80s, you know that the remote control was you as the kid. So on Sundays, football, we'd be watching football, and there was those 4 channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then that Outlier. And that Outlier channel always seemed to have some sort of a war movie on Sundays. So when the commercial hit for football, my dad would say, go, and I'd run up to the TV and I'd get to turn it to that Outlier channel and watch the war movie for 2 minutes. And then he'd say, turn it back, and I'd turn it back and we'd watch some more football. But one of those movies was The Frogmen. And it was these guys climbing up over these beaches and putting explosives on obstacles in World War II and blowing up those obstacles. And I thought, that looks pretty cool. Who are these guys? And my dad said, ask your mother. And my mom was and is a librarian. So we went down to the local library and did some research and found out about SEALs, underwater demolition teams. And I was hooked. Because the 2 takeaways back at age 7 were, hey, these are some of the most elite special operators in the world, and the training some of the toughest ever devised by a modern military. So they had me at age 7, and everything that I did from that point on was really geared towards preparing myself for SEAL training. And I said, there were a couple of videos out there you could see, a couple of pictures in a few books, and it showed cargo nets and ropes. So I was putting stuff up in the backyard that I thought would help me. And I was doing my pull-ups and sprinting hills and all that sort of a thing. So I was doing, I think, CrossFit before it existed, just by looking at the obstacle course and thinking about how I could replicate it in our backyard. But everything I did was to prepare myself for that, and then to include the writing afterwards. So I knew I wanted to join the military from an early age. And I think that was very helpful, obviously, because you can prepare, you can build the foundation. And I've never stopped building upon that foundation. And then the same thing with writing in the transition out. A lot of guys have a hard time getting out, but I knew exactly what I wanted to do and I'd prepared for it.
I want to come back to the writing in a second, and I've seen you tell that story about switching the channel during football games, but you mentioned lacrosse earlier. I'm curious. So I think you've said you weren't a big sports fan in terms of watching the games.
Yeah.
But did you play? Did you do anything athletically? And I'm kind of leading this into, did it help when you decided? I know you decided at a very young age, but rather, did it help once you were in training in Hell Week, when you were going through BUD/S? Did it help that you participated in what? Lacrosse, sports in any way?
Yep. I was never very good at it. I was a midi, but I was just okay. But I think what helped more than the team sports were the individual sports, cross country in particular, because if you're training, whether you're training, with the team, that's one thing. But if you're training by yourself on the weekends, and you're on a hill and no one's around and you can stop, and no one will know if you stop and walk to the top of that hill and then continue on, I think that really helped me, because in buds, I would think back to that. And I would think back how I didn't stop on those hills when nobody was watching. It's different if there's a coach there yelling at you, encouraging me, get up that hill or whatever they're yelling at you. But in buds, they're just yelling at you to quit. Really, they're not yelling words of encouragement.
Right. Right.
So I would think back to those times when I could have quit on things, but I didn't. I pushed through, and pushing through, I would think of the future and things that I might do, whether it was training or downrange as an operator, because before September 11th, you thought you were going to just zip on when you joined the military. You thought the special operations in particular, you thought you were going to get this pager and then you'd zip off and save the world and be back in time for beers the next night. And that really was not how it was before September 11th. We had to, you essentially had to wait till after September 11th to get to do the things you thought you were going to do ahead of time. But I think the sports did help, in particular, those individual ones, training by myself.
Okay, so a couple of things that actually are going exactly where I wanted to go when it comes to your service. First of all, back to inspiration. I think you and I are roughly the same age. I don't remember that show.
You look a lot younger.
Well, I didn't spend 20 years in combat. But I don't remember that show, but I will tell you, and I've said this before, and I say this with all the humility one can muster, that whenever I thought about service, I did think, and of course every young man thinks about service as in, I'm going to be elite. I didn't think about, and right now, Jack, for what it's worth, I've been doing a series on special operators. I've been talking to Green Berets, Marine Raiders, and Navy SEALs, because I want to understand the profession and the distinction. But I always thought, well, I would want to try to be a SEAL because I was a competitive swimmer growing up. I played water polo at Pepperdine in California. I thought, well, at least I'll have some natural inclination to do that. But back to the inspiration part of it, I mean, I'll be real with you. Like the movie Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen, when it all started to get there, it's kind of funny. And I know that I think a lot of you guys and anybody that knows something now knows how ridiculous that movie was in so many ways. But it's actually a valuable tool from a recruiting mechanism, I would think, of bringing guys in. I know you mentioned that TV show. Did that movie, when you were in, did you see a lot of guys say, I'm here because of this movie or that movie?
I did. You still hear it today. Guys will reference, and usually there's a time period generationally. So for mine, that movie was, if they didn't know about SEALs before, when that movie came out, a lot more people found out about what SEALs were, and they could go into the recruiter and ask about it. And typically, the recruiter didn't really know much about the SEAL teams even back then, because without the internet, you couldn't do that kind of research. But you could find out there were programs that would allow you to try out for that in boot camp, allow you to try out for buds to get your shot. So that's what I did. But Navy SEALs movie, I mean, yeah, there wasn't that much back then. There was a few books that had started coming out. There were some Army books, Army Special Forces type books, 5 Years to Freedom. Nick Rowe, there's the Delta Force, the first commanding officer of that unit, wrote a book called the Delta Force. So there were a few that were starting to come out. And of course, when I heard that movie was coming out, I was like, oh, Charlie Sheen. Oh man, in Platoon, he's going to be perfect in this SEAL movie. And the guy from Terminator is in it. Oh my gosh, there cannot be a better movie than this. And so I went the day before opening night, a sneak preview or something like that. I remember going to watch that movie and loving it. Of course, I go into things. It's I don't know. I look for the good in everything. But back then, you don't have anything to really compare it to. But looking back. It was one of the first movies, not the first, but one of the first, where things changed from the 80s, where people are just shooting from the hip. And now these guys start bringing, in that movie, it's MP5s, bringing it up to their shoulders and shooting and actually using the sights, or looking like they're using the sights in that movie. So there's some classic lines in there. And, a lot of people did reference that film, and it's the power of popular culture. And really around the world, the United States, Hollywood used to be kind of the greatest exporter of popular culture around the world, not just in the United States, and inspired so many people to come here because of the types of films they were making, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's started to shift a little bit I think, as more and more films come out that aren't necessarily shining a bright light on things going on in the country, but showing some of the darker sides of what's going on in the country, that sort of a thing. But for a while, anyway, it inspired a lot of people to do anything they possibly could to get to this country. So it's so the power of popular culture. It's a real thing, whether it's movies or books or TV shows. It's a real thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that now some of the younger guys, it's Zero Dark 30, it's Marcus Luttrell's book, it's a whole host of stories that have been told. And soon, by the way, I'm sure it will be the Terminal List as well as Inspiration, which, again, we're going to get to in just a moment. But here's something else I'm fascinated by. So, again, I think we're roughly the same age, and you served for 20 years, which puts your service in the SEALs, as you mentioned a moment ago, in the 90s pre-9/11. And I'm just curious, and I think I know the obvious answer is yes. There was a drastic change in the service, your mission, pre and post 9/11. I'm curious what it was like pre 9/11. That's not talked about much these days. Like, what did you do in that first? I believe it would have been your first 7 years as a SEAL or something like that. What was it like in the 90s?
Yeah, so I came in BUD/S January 97. I got to BUD/S. I got to my first SEAL team October of 97. You go into a workup that lasts about 18 months. You do some other training before you even join your platoon. You're on probation, meaning back then anyway, not today, but you're on probation, meaning you don't have a trident until you prove to the guys in your platoon that you deserve it, and you have to do some tests and things like that. So they give it to you, which was powerful. Now it's more streamlined. You get it before you show up, which is probably a better way to go to standardize things. But there was something special about the guys in your platoon deeming you worthy of wearing that trident and going into combat with them. So they put that thing on your chest and pound it in, and everybody remembers how that went down.
And by the way, Jack, I've heard either you or another SEAL talk about that's changed, and now you get your trident much earlier now. And there's been some concern about the cultural effect of getting that trident right away. Is that correct?
Yep, there's because it's that you're not going to I guess you don't have to prove yourself when you get to the team, and you kind of show up. That's the worry anyway. I don't know if it's founded or not, but the worry is you show up with you feel entitled. You've already earned it essentially just by going through this training, BUD/S and SEAL qualification training, and now you show up at your SEAL team with that. You feel entitled a little bit instead of that new guy mentality that you have. That's important because you have to be that sponge. You have to soak in that information, especially now from people who have spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan and other hotspots around the world. But when we came in, there were the Vietnam guys. There were just a couple. There was two at my SEAL team, and they only were there because they had a broken time in service. But you looked up to those guys. There were people that had maybe been at some flashpoints. One guy was on the airfield in Panama. Another guy was in Mogadishu as a sniper. So there were some touch points there, some flashpoints, but there wasn't sustained combat operations like Vietnam. But anybody that had time in Vietnam, you looked up to those guys. So much respect. Same thing, Mogadishu, same thing, Panama. But it was a little different. It was you're training for war and you're deploying for presence instead of for purpose. After September 11th, obviously that switches and you deploy for purpose. You're going downrange with a mission. But before that, you go downrange because we have maybe an agreement with a certain country and we have to have a presence there for a certain amount of time, training up their forces and whether that's in the Philippines or in Thailand or in somewhere in the Middle East. So you'd go there and do these things. And if something happened while you were downrange, then you'd go off and do it. But that was rare. Non-combatant evacuations happened a couple times from embassies, not for my platoon, but for others. So very, very few real-world operations in the 90s, unless you were in Mogadishu, unless you the one or two shipboardings that went down, but very few real-world operations. But your job is to prepare for war, and so you train, and when that call comes, then you're as ready as you can be for it. But so my second platoon is when September 11th happened. So it was 2 weeks into my second platoon deployed, and September 11th happened. It was about midnight in Guam, and phones start ringing. People start banging on doors, and we went down to the basement of the barracks and watched the Twin Towers fall on television. And we thought the next day we'd be off to Afghanistan, but it took a little while for the United States to get our act together, figure things out. And it took a couple of weeks, maybe 10 days. But then we were on planes to the Middle East, and we thought we were going to Afghanistan, but instead we took over for Team 3, who was in Kuwait doing shipboarding operations to enforce the UN embargo against Iraq, and they went to Afghanistan. But then I found myself in Afghanistan. Afghanistan fairly shortly thereafter. But everybody who wasn't deployed and didn't go right away thought we'd miss it, because the model post-Vietnam were these flashpoints, whether it was Desert One, Grenada, Mogadishu. So if you weren't there right off the bat, you thought, oh, I've missed it. I trained my whole life for this moment, and now I've missed it. And that fear was unfounded, as we've seen over the last 20 years.
All right, a couple more questions about your inspiration to serve before we move on to writing. And by the way, on that, when you receive your Trident note, I think that's a really interesting cultural question, because I've heard it both ways. One way, as you just described it, you've got to earn the respect of your team and your peers before you get the Trident. But the implication or the fallout from that was that there could be a guy on Team 3 who had to wait forever, while his guy he went through buds with is on Team 5 and he gets his really quickly. There was no standardization, and now it's standardized, but everybody gets it fairly quickly.
Exactly. And standardization is probably the way to go there. It makes it a more professional force, but you do lose. It's a trade-off, just like anything else. But it's probably the way to go as you grow to standardize and make things more professional. But hey, it was pretty cool to earn that Trident and get it pounded into your chest by the guys in your platoon.
So I'm curious. So let's ask this question, and this may be our transition into writing. Why do you think it is so many SEALs end up telling stories, end up writing books? I was on an Instagram feed. It was a Green Beret, and he was making fun of you guys, and I'm sure you guys are used to it. But he was showing all the different usages, making fun. I can't remember what it was of a SEAL book, and the comment was, every SEAL that served 4 years and had one deployment has written a book on leadership. Why is it? It does seem to be that SEALs are the celebrities of special ops.
I will say it is a saturated market there in the leadership space. But it is funny. I mean, people say, hey, third phase of buds, you learn about how to get an agent and a publisher, and you have your writing classes, and that sort of a thing. So, but I'd be curious at some point maybe to sit down and list out the number of SEAL books and the number of books from Army Special Forces guys over the years. I guess it would be pretty close.
Okay.
But SEALs, you're right. It does seem over the last 20 years to have kind of captured a little bit of that limelight. I think some of it was intentional by our senior level leaders, by green lighting movies. What was the Act of Valor? We had active duty SEAls that went and essentially played fictional characters that were SEALs in that film, and that was green lighted at a time, I think, when we needed more people. And then when it came out, we didn't need those people as much anymore. And then there was a big controversy about how much we're jumping into this limelight and the quiet professional side of the things. And just like anything else, there's going to be good books that come out. There's going to be bad books that come out. It's subjective. But I would much rather have my kids reading a book about what someone did in Iraq or Afghanistan than a book on, let's say, the Kardashians or something like that. Yeah. I think today it's important for kids to have heroes. I had my grandfather. I read everything I could read by guys in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and those inspired me. Those helped form this foundation and continued along my path, kind of spurred along by what I read in those books. There weren't as many back then, but now there's so many distractions with social media for kids, and there's so many influences that even if you pick who you follow, or you pick who your kids follow, or maybe they're following inspirational people that have a good message, things still end up in that feed. They still get sent things from friends. There's still all these inputs that we didn't have before social media that are not positive and don't help them along their journey. So I'd much rather them have read a book written by a SEAL, written by a Special Forces guy, written by a Marine. Doesn't matter, but somebody who went down range and it's easy to pick these things apart, saying, hey, it's all about you or whatever, even if it's written about the team or the mission. And I think what's important to keep in perspective is, hey, that's that person's viewpoint on either something that happened or they're in uniform. It's not the end all be all about Iraq, Afghanistan, a deployment. It's just one person's perspective, and that's going to become part of a larger group of first-person accounts when people write histories later on. But I think it's important to keep in mind. So even when I was in and people started writing books and it started to become a controversy, I knew I was going to get out and write fiction, write thrillers, but I never told anybody You want to keep those cards a little close when you're in the SEAL teams. You don't want to tell anybody you want to go to Hollywood and act or be a stuntman or write. You want to keep that stuff kind of close hold if you're in the teams. But no, I think it's like we talked about popular culture before, and some of those books, particularly the ones that are more popular, I think they are inspiring a generation. Even thrillers. I had guys have shown up at my book signings this last year, just in May, and said, "Hey, I joined the military because I read The Terminal List." And I was thinking in my head, I'm like, well, yeah, it came out in 2018. So if you read that when you're 16, 17, 18, and it inspired, multiple people came up and said that. And I was, blown away. I thought about that happening because I'm friends with David Morrell, who wrote First Blood back in 1972, a book that's never been out of print. We had the 50th anniversary, actually, this last May. But of course, with Rambo, he inspired, once again, a generation of people to join the military.
Right.
And so he's to wrestle.
I've had a chance to talk to, quite a few guys in your community. And then I'm a fan and I follow so many guys in your community. Jocko, Goggins. I've known Brandon Webb. I don't know if you know who Brandon is, who was a SEAL. And one thing that sticks out to me, and even getting to know you a little bit, Jack, there's not, at least on the surface, there's not a consistency of personality traits. You would think everybody is obviously aggro, in your face alpha. And I don't know, there's understated, there's quiet, there is in your face. I mean, is there any consistency? I know that there is the no quit resilience that has to be there, right? And I think I asked somebody else this though. Is there any way to predict who has that based upon personality traits?
No, but it's not a bad business to get into because the military is willing to spend a lot of money trying to figure out who's going to make it through these programs ahead of time so they can save money by recruiting the right types of people and getting the right types of people in the front of the pipeline. But my experience when I was in, particularly at the end, when I wasn't taking guys downrange anymore and I was at BUD/S as the operations officer, what I saw from all those programs is, no, you can't tell who's going to make it because you're looking for an intangible and you're looking for people with grit. And they haven't been tested yet, and that's why they're here. They're here to find out if they have that grit. Yes, they want to serve their country, but they've chosen to serve that country in a unit that has this crucible. And in this case, it's BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, with this thing called Hell Week. And we typically lose 80% of the guys throughout this course of instruction. But it's that grit that we're looking for. So if there's anything that is that kind of the through line of all these different personalities and backgrounds, that's it. I mean, you're looking for people with resiliency, with physical courage, with moral courage, with team ability, work well together. But really, you're looking for that intangible. And from the beginning of time, there's this a number of years, let's say 16 to 20, where you want to test yourself. And throughout from the beginning of time, there's been a test. And if you pass that test, then you can join that society. You can join that tribe. And you have something in common with all the other people in that tribe. They've all gone through it together. So you share this investment and this common touch point. And the military does that. Marine Boot Camp, Army Special Forces Q Course does it. SEAL training does it. But you're looking for that intangible. So if there's anything, but you're right. People come from all different backgrounds. They have all different personalities. And I think that's what makes us strong when it comes to adapting, particularly on the battlefield. Maybe not so good back in garrison when they want everybody to shave and have your hair cut and be in the proper uniform and, jump online to do your whatever training that's been mandated by a higher authority. Well, when you get out there, that maybe it's not so good there, but when you get downrange and the enemy is adapting so quickly because they're not a huge bureaucracy and you have all these guys from all these different backgrounds that joined a unit that they thought was to give them a little more freedom than maybe some others. Well, you have that grit and then you have all these different backgrounds, meaning everyone's bringing something different to this team, which makes you stronger and able to adapt downrange. So if anything was a strength in the SEAL teams over the last 20 years, I'd say it was that adaptability.
Okay, and now we should say, before we move on to writing, look, you're not the one deployment 4 years of service. You're 20 years in, the bulk of it through 2 wars that lasted almost the entirety of your service. And you decide, it sounds like early in life, in addition to being a SEAL, you want to be the writer of thrillers. So, again, on the note of inspiration, whatever the famous quote is, life is what? 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. I can't remember if that's the right ratio, but it's something like that. I'm curious, and I always have been. And you know, I get, by the way, Jack, you know, in a lot of ways you could say this is Will trying to put himself on the same level as Jack. Actually, probably what it would be is Will indulging in hero worship. But, you know, I did give a shot at fiction writing, by the way, and this was in my 20s, and I moved to a ranch in Montana, and I was gonna live someplace cool to do this, and I did complete the book, but it didn't really go anywhere. But in that process, I became fascinated with the process, and I read about everybody. Like, you know, I know J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter on her lunch break while working a 9 to 5 in England. I'm curious about your process. First, with the Terminal List, which I'm sure is a different process since it was your first book, and what you're doing now that you've made this a career. What is your process for writing?
Yes, the main difference between the first one and these is that the first one, there's no deadline. Your deadline is however you can get it to the best that you can possibly make it before you show it to somebody else, whether that's a friend to read, whether that's your agent, and then that agent sending it to a publisher. But there's no deadline yet. After that first one and you sign contracts, well, now you're on a deadline. So now it's one a year. But that first one, just as getting it as good as I could possibly get it. But the process has remained the same. And I think today, especially with websites everywhere and so many books, you can almost study how to do something for too long. And for me, I read On Writing by Stephen King. I read The Successful Novelist by David Morrell, the first 5 pages, maybe one other. But I could still be reading how to do something. Instead, I kind of read those and I was like, okay, got it, especially On Writing, because it's an autobiography essentially of Stephen King. But then I got to work. And the process has remained the same. So for the first one, I wrote down about 6, 7, 8, 9 different one-page executive summaries. And I picked the one that I thought was the most hard-hitting out of the gate, most likely to get noticed by a New York publisher. And it was very obvious that the Terminal List was the one. So I started with that one-page executive summary. And so I have a theme right off the bat, which is revenge. And I had a little yellow sticky on my computer that said revenge. So whether it was directly or indirectly, everything that happened, everything I wrote had to tie back to that theme. And I think that's why when it got to Simon & Schuster, eventually they had very few content edits. But and I've done that for each and every book. Theme, title. I like to have the title right out of the gate, so I'm not wasting any bandwidth worrying about coming up with a good title. That one-page executive summary and the one-page executive summary I think is important because you write that and then you read it. And you have to ask yourself, is this worth 1 year of my life? And if that answer is yes, read it again and say, okay, if someone else were to read this, and it's like a book jacket, like the back of a book type of a thing. If someone else was to read this, would they then want to invest that time in this story? Time they're never going to get back, whether they're listening to it on audio or they're reading it. They're never getting that time back, and they're trusting you with this time, which is why the product has to be the best it can possibly be. And I have to get better each and every time and even move the genre forward, even if it's just by a degree each and every time. So I take that one-page executive summary, if both those answers are yes, and then turn that into an outline. And typically I have a prologue, an epilogue, and 3 parts in the middle. This last one I had a couple more than 3, but that's just naturally how it worked out. But that's
a bullet-pointed outline, ABC 1, 2, 3. You literally structure the story before you write anything long form.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, but the key to that one is that I don't get hung up if I can't figure something out. If I'm outlining this thing and I'm in part 2 and I think, oh my gosh, how's he ever going to get out of this? Or is this going to make sense? I don't spend any time worrying about that. The time I spend is exactly the amount of time I just told you I worried about it. Just those 2 sentences. And I go around it. I just put some X's down on the page. I go over through it. And I know over the course of the next year, I'll figure it out. So I get it as good as I can possibly get it, but not so long that it's going to slow me down, because there's some things in there that I know I'll work out as I'm writing, and then I start the actual narrative. So that's how it's been for each and every book thus far, including the 6th one that I'm working on right now.
And so, okay, I love this, by the way. And by the way, that's how my brain works. Even when let's say that I'm going to guest host Tucker Carlson tonight, I think this for me was developed in law school. I think in terms of an outline, everything. It's bullet pointed, it's subcategorized. That's how my brain works. If I can visualize a framework, I know how my thoughts cohesively go together. I can't just start going. Free form. I once read that, James Joyce is a famous writer, and he wrote Stream of Consciousness. And his I think it was his girlfriend or his wife came in. He was distraught. His head was in his hands. And she said, "What's wrong, James?" And he said, "I've only written 10 words today." And she goes, "Well, that's great for you. What are you upset about?" And he goes, "Well, I just don't know what order they go in yet." So, I know where I'm going before any word or thought is put down on paper. But now you're in the long form process, Jack. I'm serious. I love this. Like, do you wake up right away, make a cup of coffee and start writing? Do you have a house outside of your house? Like, what time of day and how do you treat your surroundings when you write?
Yeah, so this is the part I need to get better at, that I'm still working on. Because up to this point, I feel kind of like it's been a startup in your garage, and you're just doing everything you possibly can to grow this readership, to let people know that, let's say, if you have a computer thing in your garage, 1978, you're letting people know that this computer exists, and you're
right.
Taking calls, and you're letting people know you're putting on little shows where you show them what it can do, and but you also have to.
You're on the Will Cain podcast early in the morning.
Exactly. So I'm not writing right now, but I do have my coffee, and typically I just need a quiet place to write, and that's changed a little bit. I was working at the library for quite some time, a local library here where you can put your name down and then go into one of these little booths and spend some time there. But if some high school kid needs to work on a history project and you've been there for 2 hours, guess what? You get bounced out of there. So I did that for a while. And then of course, when COVID hit, I couldn't go to the library anymore. So I was at home with my wonderful wife and 3 wonderful children and our dog, all in the same house. And that was I guess when you close the door for anybody who has spent time at home working, it's like a magnet. It's like no one wants to talk to you until you close the door to your office, and then everybody wants to talk to you for some reason. So I have to figure out places to write that are quiet. And this last time I ended up renting an Airbnb here in town and just going there and locking down and writing from the second I got up till all through the night sometimes, then grabbing a little sleep and just getting back in it. So I like to immerse. It's really quiet, places that you're not interrupted. So I do have a place now that's separate from the house to write that's almost finished. And so I think I'll be writing a lot of this out there. But even so, it's even if you're writing and you have a quiet place in your house, or for me anyway, but I go downstairs and I'm not physically typing on the keyboard and the rest of the family sees that you're not physically engaged in the process of writing, well, then the interruptions come. But if you're in that cabin, let's say I get hungry and I'm writing or I'm thinking about something, well, I can walk the 5 feet in this little cabin to the refrigerator, grab something, walk back without interruption, still working on that problem set, figuring it out. And then I sit back down. So it's uninterrupted time. And so that's for me is the most important. So I'm still figuring that out as far as what to do each and every day. But this is my year to get organized and come up with a schedule and figure out how to block time off and just get more effective and efficient with my time instead of running around like a crazy person all the time.
My suspicion is you'll love it. Because you know what, Jack, I did what you said, by the way. I went too far in studying how to write. And I read about I loved hearing about people's processes. But it does seem like people gravitate or converge in, like, I write from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. and I do it in this house behind my house. You know, it does seem that this routine is something that you eventually where you arrive. What am I telling you? You've written 5. How many books are you on?
No, I know I need to do it. No, it's good. That's good advice. And this is my year to do it. But then when I get to the editing stage, as far as process, so let's say I finish part 1, then I'll print part 1. And then I'll go to a different area. I won't be in the same chair that I was doing the writing in for whatever reason. I'll go to a different place, like sit in a leather chair where it's quiet and have my red pen right here. And I'll go through it because it's different for whatever reason for me than reading it on the screen here, printing it and sitting down somewhere else and then going through it with the red pen. For whatever reason, I find so many more things when I do that and I put myself in the place of the reader rather than the writer. And then I'll come back to my computer and take all those things that I marked with my red pen and make those changes and then move on to the next part.
How many times will you edit before you send it to your editor?
It's timeline based. You could do it forever and you probably would get better. Buy a degree if you hold on to it for another 5 months, 6 months, 7 months. But eventually you got to send that thing off. And then what she does best, Emily Bessler at Simon & Schuster, amazing. But she'll go through it as well and then ask some questions typically. So if it's content edits, she'll say, hey, this part right here was a little confusing to me as a non-military person. Can you make this a little more palatable for someone who's not in the military? Check. Or, hey, I don't think this part really made sense. Can you go back and set it up? So there'll be like 3 or 4 things like that typically. And then I'll dive back in. At the same time, I'm still making other edits that I find. And then I'll send it back to her. And then off it goes to copy editing and then to the printer. And then whatever mistakes are in there are in forever.
So I think I read Grisham say this. He's on a once-a-year cycle as well, or was at one time. I think I read Grisham say basically it's a 6 to 7 month process for him and I don't know if he outlines. I don't remember that. He probably does. But from outline to finished editing process with the first draft in there, let's call it 6 to 7 months. And then I think he said, I need 3 to 5 months of fallow period, which is probably a good way to say I just want to relax and be on vacation. But he said that's useful time for his brain to begin to think about what the next year will be like and what his next book will be about. What is start to finish for you? You're doing it once a year. You have a deadline now. I'm curious, is it 12 months and you just have to start on the next one right away? Is it 6 months? What is your process from start to finish?
It's 12 months right now. There's a little bit of overlap with the next book, not too much, but a little bit. But eventually, I would like to get on that. John Grisham is a great example. I mean, what an amazing guy. And he was actually an inspiration to start my second book before I'd even submitted the first one to Simon & Schuster, because I knew the story about him writing A Time to Kill first, when he's an attorney. He can't give that book away, and then he writes The Firm. And The Firm takes off. Tom Cruise is in the movie, and we've had a John Grisham book every year since. But had he thought, oh man, no one likes this first book, I'm just going to keep practicing law here. I guess this didn't work out. Had he done that, he might just be now retiring from his law firm, maybe, or maybe he'd still be working. But he didn't stop. He wrote that next book. So I was always going to write that second book, which is why I flew to Mozambique to do the research before I had any deal with Simon & Schuster. Before I'd sent that first book to Simon & Schuster, I knew there were always going to be two, and then if both didn't hit, then I was going to reevaluate my choices. But I knew because of that Grisham example, and he's got it down. He's got 6 months of writing and then 6 months not off, but because he's thinking about other storylines, things he wants to do. He has that flexibility now. But I'm working my way towards that. It's a 6 month. I think that is a very appropriate for these types of novels, for thrillers. That's an appropriate amount of time to work through any issues you may have, to edit, and to send it to your publisher, and then take a breath, figure out what you're going to do next, and then start it again. But I'm not on that yet. Now it's just there's so many things going on. I'm writing the second season of The Terminal List, which is because if we get the green light, I want to be prepared. So I have the outline for that. They haven't called with it yet, but if they call, I have it worked out. So I was just working on that yesterday. I worked on all the scripts for this, and then I went on set, because you're continually working on these scripts for the show, because, well, what looked good on paper, when you actually set foot out there on set and look around, it doesn't make much sense anymore. Kind of like a plan in the military. Air-conditioned building, it sounds great, but then the enemy gets a vote. And then actors, they might have brought something different to the role in episode 1 and 2 that impact things that happen in 4, 5, and 6. So you're constantly evolving these scripts. So it's been a busy time.
Okay, I want to save one more question on writing, and you've given me a ton of time, which I appreciate. And then I want to save a few questions for the series really quickly. But one more question on writing. The perfectionism thing. I find that also fascinating. The first book versus the second, third, fourth. The deadline requires you to stop being a perfectionist. You have the luxury of being a perfectionist with the first book. By the way, this is my hang up. I told you I outline. Let's say then I have to write a monologue. I don't like writing long form versus an outline, because all of a sudden perfectionism sets in, and I battle it with myself. I'm just curious, now that you have a deadline, you just can't be a perfectionist anymore, right? I mean, that's got to. And by the way, also as a SEAL, where your pre-mission training and pre-mission planning is probably a process of perfectionism. Now I know then once you dive into it, then it's all calling audibles, or not all, but you need to be able to call audibles. I'm just curious, is that a huge struggle, like battling yourself with perfectionism?
Well, it's really, I've always been a student. So I'm a student of warfare, a student of writing, of this genre, of the craft. I always want to get better. I always want to move that genre forward even if it's just by a degree. But even with that first one, it's the same as with these others, because you can spend, although you're right in the fact that you eventually have to send it off now at the deadline. But that first one, I could still be working on it if I wanted to make it better. Right. So I get it to that place where if I spend the next 40 years on it, it's going to get better, but by about that much, by not much right there. So some of the best novels ever written are probably on somebody's computer or on a stack of papers next to their bed, typed out in a drawer, because they're still trying to make it a little bit better. So eventually you have to get to that place where you're like, all right, this is about as good as I can get it, unless I spend the next 40 years on it, and then it's going to get better by a degree or two. So when that first one was at that stage, that's when I sent it to Simon and Schuster. So that's how
hard to know when you're at that stage. That's an exercise in self-awareness.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So and it's subjective. So I just got it to that place where I felt comfortable with it being as good as I could probably get it without professional eyes on it, and then sent it to Simon and Schuster. And same with these. Is that I could always call and be like, hey, I need a few more days. I need a couple more weeks. It's not quite there yet. And I've never made those calls because I know the date. It's semi-flexible. It's not like it's like for you guys. Hey, cameras are rolling. Last commercial before after the break, and you're on.
Right.
Like you can't say
right.
a little more time to prep here. Like you're going. This is a little more fluid. The deadlines in publishing, especially if you're delivering for the publisher, then you get a little more leeway. So I'm very comfortable with these kind of deadlines. They're a little bit flexible that allow me to, something happened with the kids. I need to do that today for some reason, and I couldn't write or whatever it is. So I'm all very comfortable with these kind of deadlines. But yeah, you just get it as good as you can get it, and you have to know that it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something that you miss. There's always going to be something that the copy editors, the best copy editors in the world, down there in the basement at Simon and Schuster, that's where I picture them anyway, working away. There's always going to be things that they miss. And today, guess what? Everyone can point out a mistake. And you don't have to put in the work to be a critic today. Let's say in the 80s, 90s, you had to put in the work. And then maybe you got a job at a newspaper or a magazine or whatever it was, and then you got to write a critique about something. Well, today, you don't have to put in any work. All you have to do is sign up for an Instagram or a Twitter account, and you can be that critic, and you can shoot those arrows. And that's a tough part, especially for writers, because maybe you just want to write, and now you've put this thing out there, and you can't necessarily not see reviews. Whereas let's say 1985, all you have to do is not open Parade magazine or the New York Times, and you're not seeing a review. And that's if you're lucky to be in those places, getting reviewed, which is a very slim, very small amount of writers and books. But you're going to get those today. You're going to get those arrows. So you have to be prepared to step out there, and everyone can sling it. Which is,
you're getting them, and I've seen you talk about this. But on the plus side, you're getting the right reviews from the people. Your Rotten Tomato rankings on the Terminal List on Amazon is, I think, 95% with the audience, 43% with the critics. It's exactly where you want to be honest. Yeah. You don't want it reversed.
No, we'd have a problem.
But
reversed.
And I've seen you say, by the way. So you've already told the national audience. You told Tucker Carlson. You made this for people, not for critics, anyway. I'm curious, though, and you alluded to this earlier. Is it hard? I listened to when we talked on television, I did the audiobook first with my children on a road trip across the American West, which, for all that the Amazon series is, earmuffs, because the book is incredibly more violent than what was captured, by the way, even on television. And so I have two boys. They're young, but they're fans. Let's put it that way. They liked it. As do I. I'm a big fan. But I did notice, as is always the case, the series is different than the book in a lot of ways. Is that hard for you? I've always wondered that for an author to say, here I have this product with even, the plot is only slightly tweaked. Some characters are tweaked. There's some new action that didn't exist in the book. Is that hard? You put together this cohesive story, and now the story has to change.
Yeah, no, for me, it wasn't because I expected it. That wasn't a surprise to me. I went in knowing that I don't know much about screenwriting. So I went in as a student, like I do with everything. And they wanted me involved, which is not typically the case. Usually they want to get rid of authors, so you're not there on set yelling about how they ruined your vision, which is typically the case. So it wasn't hard because, and I always think back to the example of First Blood, the book, 1972, very different than the Stallone movie in 1983. Both amazing. But if you're to watch the movie with the book First Blood in hand and just go through and make little check marks next to the things that were different, and that's going to be your metric, you're going to have a miserable experience. And I guess that's one way to go through life, but that's not really how I go through life. Mm-hmm. And I knew there were going to be changes, but what was important to Chris Pratt, what was important to Antoine Fuqua, and the showrunner, David DiGilio, was that we keep it grounded in the foundation of the novel. We have 8 episodes, 1 hour each. So things were going to have to get shaved off. We weren't going to be able to kill as many people. There weren't going to be able as many characters because we had to show the law enforcement perspective. Otherwise, we were going to kill Chris Pratt. We almost killed him anyway, carrying the weight of this on his shoulders. Everything is pretty much from his perspective in the book, for the most part, and in the series as well. But we have a law enforcement perspective, so we had to create some characters really to give Chris some breathing room, and then also to show some parallel storylines, how law enforcement is looking at this, create some tension there, and move the plot forward visually, which is different than a novel. So I knew it was going to be different, and that was fine, especially when you have this trust with this team. When you hand it something over, you have to have that trust. That's why for me, it was never about the money. It was about making something special, and this is the team to do it. I couldn't have asked for a better team.
So last two questions about this, and this will wind up our interview, and they're both about Hollywood. One about Chris and Antoine, but one about Hollywood, quote-unquote Hollywood in general. By the way, your theme that you wrote on your computer, I mean, it definitely comes through. If someone were to ask me, what's the terminal list, what's it about, I would say revenge. And I love a revenge book or movie. And so I would put it in the same category if I were recommending it to people as, did you like Wrath of Man with Jason Statham? It's kind of in that vein. Did you love Man on Fire with Denzel Washington? It's in that vein, which I love both of those movies. Revenge and bank heist.
The book, A.J. Quinnell's book, Man on Fire, very different than the movie with Denzel Washington. And there's a movie also in the 80s as well. Joe Pesci's in it. So yeah, very different. But unless you're a student of it, you wouldn't even probably, most people don't even know that today. But I was studying that my whole life. I read the book in the 80s. I watched the movie in the 80s. I was excited for the Denzel Washington movie, excited to see how they adapted it with those changes. So I've been a student of this the entire time. So I knew it was going to change based on the examples that I read from this foundation that I built growing up.
My suspicion is, Jack, that you're going to have to stop reading and consuming as much if you want to reduce your writing timeline. My suspicion might be that if it's taking, well, also you're producing and writing television series as well, so you got a lot on your plate.
Luckily I read all these things from like 1980 up to 2016. Okay. So the foundation was built. I didn't wake up one morning and say, what should I have been reading for the past 30, 35, 40 years in order to prepare myself for this? No, there you go. I'd already,
So here's my last two questions about this I was alluding to. So I have a friend who is a writer. He has multiple careers, and he wants to screenwrite as well. And I've heard him talk about this, like how hard it is to get a show greenlit in modern Hollywood without satisfying the quotas of modern Hollywood. In other words, what's clear about the Terminal List is the show services the story. It's about revenge, and it's about Navy SEALs. In the process of that, there is natural diversity to the story. In other words, there are law enforcement officers and SEAL team operators that are all of various ethnic backgrounds. But what I've heard is, well, if you have a story where the majority of the characters are white or whatever it may be, that's not going to work anymore. And we need to check all of these boxes that aren't necessarily, in service of the story. They're in service of something else today. And I'm curious, did you experience that? Was there a push to, and not that you would resist it, we all want to have a story in a world that is reflective of reality, right? But the question is, when do we push reality beyond its bounds to service something outside of the story? Was that a pressure point in creating the series?
I guess only so much is that I knew that it was out there in the same way that you're framing it. So I did think about it in those terms. And then, if I think about it right now, I can see that if you get too focused on that and lose focus on the story, that perhaps you're not going to have a very good show or a very good film, because instead of focusing on making the best product, the best film, the best series that you possibly can, you're worried about these other things that are maybe not as critical to a story or to your storyline. It doesn't make the storyline better. So I can see that being an issue depending on the team that you have put together. So, I was shielded from most of that. So if there was a lot of that. And so there's some things I was shielded from. Like I didn't see the dailies on set. Also, I saw the episodes, like the director's cut would come in early, and then the network cut, the editor's cut, and I'd go through those once again with red pen in hand and making my notes and all that sort of a thing. So I was shielded from some things, but I can see it being an issue, I guess, is the best way to put it. And you just gotta work with it the best you possibly can, but always keep the story the first and foremost in your mind, because once again, people are trusting you with their time. They're never getting that time back. They don't know how much time they have on this earth, whether you have a day, whether you have seconds, whether you have minutes, whether you have 5 years or 10 years, and they're choosing to watch the show that you made, to spend, in this case, 8 hours, in other cases, an hour and a half, 2 hours. But guess what? They're never getting those 2 hours back. They've trusted you with it. That's a responsibility as a storyteller, as a creator, as a visionary that you have to your audience. And if you lose focus on the story and sacrifice it for something else, then you've wasted those people's time that they're never going to get back. So that's for me what I think about when I'm writing, or whether I'm doing anything, whether it's a post on Instagram or Twitter. I'm thinking about, does this add value to somebody's life? And if the answer is no, then it's not getting posted. It has to add value.
All right, last thing is on the team. Antoine Fuqua, Chris Pratt. It sounds like this is not just what you visualized, but I saw somebody say this was the fastest they'd seen something go from the page to the screen in, what was it, 5 years? Apparently, Chris, everything I've read, Chris, it's his passion project. And I think I read that you have, through the teams, through the SEAL teams, you were able to get it into both of those guys' hands before it even came out. So it just sounds like the team, you were involved in something here that is just absolutely, I don't want to call it kismet because it was earned, but, it was unique.
Yeah, and I didn't know I had any of these connections at all, whether it was to publishing or to Hollywood. I just wanted to focus on the story, make the best book I possibly could, and then I got this publishing deal at Simon & Schuster. Books getting ready to come out. I learned about these things called galleys, which are like a rough draft, essentially, that go out to reviewers for those listening ahead of time, typically, so that when the book comes out, they can review it and talk about it with you on an interview or something like that. So book was coming out in March of 2018, and I got a call in November of 2017, so a few months before it came out, from an old buddy from the SEAL teams, Jared Shaw. And he calls me out of the blue. I hadn't talked to him in 5 years. And he said, hey, man, I always wanted to thank you for what you did for me in the SEAL teams. And I couldn't really remember what that was. And he said, hey, you sat me down in your office when you found out I was getting out of the military. You talked to me about transitioning out. You introduced me to people in the private sector. You followed up with me. No one else did that. And I always wanted to thank you. And I said, no problem. How's it going? And he said, it's going great, but I heard you have this book coming out. And I said, yeah, it's coming out in a few months. I can send you this galley copy thing that I just found out existed like 2 weeks prior. And I sent it to him. And he said, I want to give it to a friend of mine. And I was like, who's that? And he said, Chris Pratt. So I was like, that's convenient, because I had pictured him playing this role as I was writing. Then another friend, about a month later, gave it to Antoine Fuqua. And that's the exact director that I pictured as I was writing in that Coronado, California rental house.
That's
and
amazing.
So Antoine wanted it. Chris wanted it, and then they talked because they knew each other and said, hey, let's do this thing together. And now we're all three executive producers on it. So, it's one of those things. I didn't expect any return. I didn't even remember that I had done that for Jared, but he never forgot. And that's why we have this show today. And that's why all 350 people during COVID had jobs in Hollywood during that kind of uncertain time when we were filming. And Jared now is a producer on this, technical advisor on this, and plays Boozer in the show. So he plays the SEAL.
Oh, he's Boozer.
Show.
Okay, yeah. That's who that is. Interesting.
Yeah, that's Jared Shaw right there. So without him, this would not have been made. Chris would still not know that it exists. So I'm forever indebted to Jared for giving it to Chris. And then obviously Chris is just an incredible person, normal guy. That's one of my other takeaways when you talk about Hollywood. My takeaway from set was just how normal everybody was. They're all so good at their jobs. They're at the top of their game, whether it's a stuntman, whether it's craft food services, whether it's hair and makeup, whatever it is, they're at the top of their game. And so many of them stopped by on set when they didn't have to and made a point to come up to me and say, hey, I've been on hundreds of these sets and nothing has felt like this. You have something special here. And that's due to Chris and Antoine. Antoine right at the top, setting that tone strategically for the entire set. Chris down here tactically every day, bringing that enthusiasm and that humor and that inspiration for people, being a normal guy, being approachable on set, and just keeping everybody positive, moving forward through what is really a tough shoot for 5 months. And a lot can happen in 5 months in people's lives. That's the other part of it. You think you just show up and do a job and that's it. No, that showrunner, David DiGilio, who's like the single point of contact for everything in a show. He essentially managing multiple directors, managing all this chaos. He is invested personally, professionally, just like I was as a leader in the SEAL teams, in the lives of everybody on set, from number one on the call sheet all the way down to the brand new intern who's showing up with donuts and coffee. Involved with them professionally and personally, and I didn't really expect that, but that was cool to see. Really cool to see.
Well, so let me say this as we wrap up. So Chris Pratt seems like an authentic and approachable and friendly guy. It's nice to hear that's who he is in the real world. As do you. I cannot pretend that I know you well, but you certainly come across as a really authentic guy. And in a lot of ways, I've talked today about inspiration. You're living the life that I dreamed of living, being a Navy SEAL, being a thriller writer, now producing television shows. So I'm jealous of you. You're living an awesome life from the outside, and I appreciate you sharing it for an hour today. And I wish you the best, although I'm afraid that the best is going to be very difficult because you have some hard choices. Are you the next, Tom Clancy? Are you the next Taylor Sheridan, the creator of the Yellowstone series and the spinoffs, but only in the military? Are you both? There's only so much time in one man's life. But I have a feeling you have some hard choices, all of them potentially almost certainly successful in front of you, man. And I really appreciate you spending so much time with me today.
No, thank you so much for having me. And I feel like I know you too. We have mutual friends, and thank you so much also for all you do and for always standing strong for freedom out there. So that's sincerely appreciated as well.
All right. I appreciate it, man. Hope to talk to you again.
Sounds great. Take care.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.